Welcome to part 2 of Pierrepoint, A Family of Executioners. We pick up the story in 1902. Henry Pierrepoint has successfully come through his training, and despite being offered a number of engagements that came to nothing, he has since assisted James Billington on 2 executions. Within weeks of Pierrepoint helping the long-serving hangman into his railway carriage at Manchester's Victoria Station, following the execution for Bolton murder of Patrick McKenna, James Billington passes away, creating a vacancy for a chief executioner. Considering that the execution of the 54-year-old slaughterman for the murder of his paramour was to be the first time that Henry Pierrepoint was solely responsible for an execution, he made little reference to the significance of it in either serialisation of his memoirs. Richard Wigley was convicted of the murder of 28-year-old Mary Eliza Barron at Westbury, Shropshire. They had been going out together for a number of years since he had parted from his wife, and when they met she was working as a barmaid. Mary soon left her job and found work at another public house near Billington, where Wigley worked, so they could spend more time together. Then she suddenly ended the relationship and returned to her old job. Wigley took the split badly and began making frequent visits to her place of work. She told him there was no hope they would get back together and wrote asking him to stay away from her. She also told other members of the staff at the pub if he called for her, they were to say she was unavailable. On Saturday morning, the 30th of November 1901, wearing his butcher's apron and carrying 2 knives in a leather pouch, Wigley arrived in Westbury. Inside the pub he ordered a drink, drank it quietly, but asking for another, was told by Mary he had drunk enough and she refused to serve him. He asked again why she would not change her mind, but Mary immediately turned her back on him and walked away briskly. Wigley followed her behind the bar, put his left arm around her neck and with his right pulled a knife from his apron pouch and drew the blade across her throat, causing an enormous gash. She died almost immediately. At his trial, Wigley said he had killed Mary because if he could not have her, no one else would. He had penned a letter before setting out to Westbury stating his intention to kill and said he would be ready to die for what he had done. His only defence was insanity, and evidence showed that his mother had been admitted to the Salop County Lunatic Asylum. When the Under-Sheriff received notification to employ an executioner to carry out sentence passed on Wigley, he wrote to William Billington offering him the engagement. Following the death of his father, all engagements in the diary had been carried out by Billy Billington, assisted by his elder brother Thomas. Tommy had not been in good health himself, and less than a month after his father's death, he too passed away. Billington wrote back informing the Under-Sheriff he was unavailable on that date, having accepted the offer to hang a young lorry driver at Maidstone. Assisting him would be his younger brother John, better known as Jack Billington, who had recently graduated from the hangman's training school. Following a government inquiry into how executioners were recruited and trained, the executioners and assistants who had been on the list when Pierrepoint had applied a year earlier had all been rejected and struck off, and apart from Pierrepoint and the Billington brothers, the only person active on the list of executioners was Rochdale barber John Ellis. Between Pierrepoint and Ellis they had assisted at just 3 executions, but nevertheless both had been fully trained to carry out an execution, and with Henry claiming seniority by just a fortnight, it was he who was asked to officiate. Richard Wigley was duly dispatched without any problems or incident, as nothing appears in his memoirs or Home Office records to suggest otherwise. On the 29th of April, Pierrepoint assisted Billy Billington for the first time, when together they dispatched 56-year-old Charles Earle, a retired baker from Mortlake, who had shot dead a woman through jealousy. Earle was hanged at Wandsworth Prison, having told the governor the day before his execution, on hearing that a reprieve had been refused, that it was a good job too. 1902 was to become a busy and profitable year for the young hangman. At the end of July, went to Derby to assist Billy Billington again. This time the condemned man was John Bedford, a labourer from Chesterfield, who beat to death with a poker the woman he'd been having an affair with when she refused to leave her husband for him. 2 weeks later, again assisting William Billington, Pierrepoint was engaged in the execution of George Hibbs, a 40-year-old skilled mechanic from Battersea, who killed his landlady, Miriam Tighe. They had been out drinking, and when they returned to the lodgings, Hibbs tried to get her to pawn some items so they could buy more drink. When she refused, he stabbed her to death. At his Old Bailey trial, Hibbs said he blamed it all on drink and hoped his execution would serve as a lesson to others. At the end of September, Billington and Pierrepoint carried out the first execution at Pentonville Prison, using the giant wooden beams that had previously been in place at Newgate. 23-year-old John MacDonald was hanged for the murder of John Groves, who stabbed to death after a quarrel over money. 6 weeks later, Harry was back at Pentonville, again assisting Billington, to hang Henry Williams, a 32-year-old former soldier who Pierrepoint later described as the bravest man he ever hanged. Williams had slit the throat of his 5-year-old daughter Margaret at their home in Fulham in September. Having returned home from serving in the Boer War to suspect his wife had been unfaithful, he covered the body of his daughter with the Union flag, then gave himself up, telling police he had killed her so she wouldn't grow up to be like her mother. He was sentenced to death at the Old Bailey and hanged 2 months and a day after committing the murder. Recording the case in his memoirs, Harry said that Williams walked bravely to the scaffold and stood erect on the drop while they prepared him for execution. The memoirs then erroneously state that Harry placed a noose around the neck of the condemned man, an act always carried out by the chief and never designated to the assistant. In December, Pierrepoint was back at Manchester Strangeways Jail for the hanging of another Bolton-born criminal when he assisted at the execution of Henry McWiggins, known locally as Harry Mack, who committed a horrific murder in nearby Oldham. 29-year-old Mack, a foreman fireman and a petty criminal, had been living with Esther Bedford since June 1902. Initially they had a happy relationship, but he had started to act violently towards her. On Saturday 2nd of August, their landlady heard noises from the front bedroom and found Mack dragging Esther around the room by her hair before he struck her in the face and kicked her as she lay on the floor. A week later, as Esther slept, he woke her by savagely kicking her and then hit her in the face with a shovel. Advised to call the police, Esther refused, saying she didn't want to cause trouble for Harry Mack. In truth, she was terrified of him. Monday the 11th of August, screams were heard coming from Mack's room and Esther was found lying face down on the bed in agony. Mack had thrown a kettle of boiling water at her before fleeing the house. Having spent the rest of the night drinking heavily, he returned at midnight and kicked Esther several times in the stomach. On the following morning, a doctor was called, quickly followed by the police. Taken to hospital, it was found that the brutal kicking had caused Esther's bladder to rupture. With the police advised she was unlikely to last the day, statements were taken at her bedside. Again, she was too terrified to testify against Mack, denying the landlady's claims he had kicked her, adding that the scalding was an accident. And Mack, who had been held in custody following her admission to hospital, was then charged with murder. Tried before Mr Justice Jelf, the defence claimed the accounts of the attack had been greatly exaggerated by the witnesses and offered a plea of guilty of manslaughter. It took the jury just 20 minutes to return a verdict of guilty of murder. Mack weighed 168 pounds and stood a little under 5 foot 9 inches tall. Working out a drop of 6 foot 9, the execution was timed at 65 seconds. At the inquest, the coroner recorded that the death had been due to dislocation of the second and fourth vertebrae. Harry's next entry in the diary is interesting. He notes that he assisted at the execution of Thomas Fairclough Barrow at Pentonville on the 9th of December. He records that the condemned man was 49 years old, weighed 137.5 pounds, stood 5 foot 8.5 inches tall and was given a drop of 6 foot 6. Barrow was partially disabled and lived as man and wife with his stepdaughter Emily Coates, aged 32, at Wapping. In October 1902, he saw her drinking with another man and becoming violent against her. She feared for her life. As a result, she left him and took out a summons for assault. On the 18th of October, he approached her as she walked to work and stabbed her several times in the heart. She died instantly. At his Old Bailey trial, his weak defence was based on insanity. Prison records list the hangman as William Billington, assisted by his brother John. The details of the prisoner's height, weight and drop differ slightly from those recorded by Harry. Why should he record the details in his diary if he wasn't present doesn't make any sense. Perhaps this was an administrative error at the prison. However, this execution is recorded in the diary and makes up the total of 105 executions credited to Henry Pierrepoint. There was no confusion surrounding the next entry in the diary. William and Elizabeth Brown had been married for 22 years. On the 2nd of November, they were heard to quarrel in a public house at Mortlake, South London, and on the following morning, 42-year-old Brown, a labourer, went to a neighbour's house and said that his wife was dead. The police were called and found Elizabeth's body at the foot of the stairs. Arrested and charged with murder, he claimed Elizabeth had fallen down the stairs, but later he was alleged to have made a statement admitting killing his wife. At the Old Bailey trial, Brown denied making such a statement. The key witness for the prosecution was a young neighbour who claimed he had seen through a window Brown beating his wife. As the sentence of death was passed, the victim's father stood up in court and shouted to the judge, "Give him mercy, my lord. I know her faults, and he was a good husband to her for 20 years. As petitions for clemency were being forwarded to the Home Secretary, and with the Billington brothers engaged at a double execution at Durham, the Governor of Wandsworth wrote to Henry, engaging him as a chief executioner, and, as on his previous engagement as number 1, he was to be assisted by John Ellis. Brown was given a drop of 6 foot, and the execution passed off without incident. The last execution of 1902 took place at Warwick on the 30th of December, and again Henry was asked to act as chief executioner, after Billington had to turn down the offer, being engaged for a job in Ireland. George Place had taken lodgings with Eliza Chetwynd at Baddesley Enzer in Warwickshire, and shortly afterwards a 28-year-old minor began a relationship with her 30-year-old daughter, also named Eliza. Within a year, George and the younger Eliza were living together as man and wife, and she became pregnant. A son was born, and Eliza took out a bastardy order, naming George as the father of the child. Hearing of this, he became enraged, stormed out of the house and did not return for 2 days. On Saturday the 23rd of August, he was seen brandishing a revolver in a public house, claiming he was going to make the Chetwynds pay. In the early hours of the following morning, an armed and angry Place went to the house. Shots were fired, and Eliza Sr. and the still unnamed child died instantly. Her daughter died later from her injuries. Eliza's brother heard 3 shots and saw Place coming out of the bedroom holding the revolver. At his trial, Place said it had been his intention to shoot himself after he'd killed the Chetwynds, but had changed his mind. His defence was insanity. As Pierrepoint and Ellis went to work, the assistant noted Henry had an assured confidence, as though he had been doing this for years. 1902 ended with a total of 25 executions being carried out, with Henry involved in 9 of them, bringing in a healthy income to supplement his salary from the furniture shop. 1903 was also to be a busy year for Henry Pierrepoint. The first executions that year were in Ireland, carried out by William Billington, and the first date in Henry's diary was to assist at the double execution at Holloway of 2 nurses who had been convicted at the Old Bailey for the murder of a young child. 29-year-old Amelia Sack ran a nursing home in East Finchley, London, where, for a fee, unmarried mothers would be looked after until they had given birth and helped to find a suitable foster home for the newborn infants. She had a business partner, 54-year-old Annie Walters, to whom she would pass on the children for rehousing. On occasions when she couldn't place a child with suitable parents, Walters would resort to administering a few drops of morphine-based drugs which caused babies to die from asphyxia, or to smothering the child with a pillow. In August 1903, a Miss Galley gave birth to a boy at Amelia Sack's nursing home. It was around this time that the police had become suspicious of the activities of the 2 women, and surveillance was put on the house. On Tuesday the 18th of November, when Annie Walters left her lodgings carrying a small bundle, she was followed to South Kensington railway station, where detectives stopped her. The bundle contained the dead body of Miss Galley's child. Cause of death was reported to be asphyxia, and it appeared that the baby had been smothered. Walters claimed she had been taking the child to Kensington to meet a potential foster mother, and when the child began to cry loudly, she administered 2 drops of chlorodyne in the milk. Amelia Sack denied giving children to Walters, but when her home was searched, over 300 articles of baby clothing was found. Detectives reasoned this suggested more victims, and there had been a spate of small bodies found in the River Thames or uncovered on rubbish dumps in recent years. They may together have been responsible for around 20 deaths. Harry met up with both William and John Billington and travelled across to Holloway Jail on the afternoon of Monday the 2nd of February 1903. The case had filled the newspapers since Mr Justice Darling had presided over the trial in December, and as the date of execution arrived, crowds were already hovering around the gates of the prison, hoping to catch sight of the executioners. The hangmen managed to slip inside unnoticed and made their way along the long narrow corridors and up 2 flights of cast iron stairs until they reached the condemned cells. Each woman sat with 2 wardresses watching over her. A matron entered the cell at the request of the hangmen and got the prisoners to move to the other side of the table so they could assess their build and general physique. Once Billy Billington had sized up the first of the condemned women, Harry followed and realised he was looking into the cell of Mrs Sack. He saw she was a tall, gaunt woman who seemed to realise her position most keenly. Through the small peephole, he saw she presented a pitiful appearance, a poorer wreck of humanity as I have ever seen, he later noted. Weariness clouded her face and stray tears rolled down her cheeks. Silently moving aside so the younger Billington could observe, he followed Billy down the corridor and waited in turn to observe Mrs Walters. Her demeanour presented the hangman with something of a shock. Her features showed no trace of emotion. Describing her as stout and stocky, Harry recorded she was cheerful and talkative, as if unaware her last hours were ebbing away. Details of the prisoner's height and weight were passed to the hangman, and as they rigged the gallows it was decided that in case of emergency, 2 male warders should be brought in from nearby Pentonville. It was feared Mrs Sack's distress may cause upset to the female warders if she became overcome when the moment arrived. The morning broke cold and frosty as the hangmen went across to the execution shed to finish their preparations. At a few minutes to 8, they were in position outside the condemned cells. As they waited for a signal from the governor, Harry silently raised the peephole into Mrs Sack's cell. She was, in his words, broken up, her appearance grotesque with her hair having been scraped up in a peculiar fashion to stop it fouling with the noose. The chimes of the hour rang out on the adjacent church clock as they entered the cell. As Harry pinioned her arms, Sack swooned as if in a faint. A warder whispered words of comfort to her as she was led out into the corridor. In contrast, Mrs Walters submitted bravely to the pinioning and obeyed the instructions from the elder Billington to follow him as he walked out of the cell. The 2 women came face to face for the first time since sentence of death had been passed on them. Harry took a grip of Mrs Sack and steadied her on the short walk to the gallows. She was crying bitterly and barely conscious. Mrs Walters followed behind, quite bravely and calm. In a flash, both women were on the trap, and as Harry dropped to his knees to fasten the legs on Mrs Sack, Jack Billington did the same to Mrs Walters. Billy Billington then placed the noose and cap over the culprits' heads, and as he moved across to the lever, Mrs Walters cried out in a firm voice, "Goodbye, Sack." The younger woman was about to fall in a faint as Harry leapt to his feet and steadied her arm. Seconds later, the doors cracked open and the Finchley baby farmers had paid the ultimate penalty. They had made no confession. 1 month later, Harry was back in London, this time to Wandsworth Jail, where he was engaged to help execute 44-year-old Edgar Edwards, an habitual criminal with a long string of convictions for theft and burglary. Released in 1902 after serving 5 years at Northampton, he moved back to London, telling his wife he was taking over a shop in Camberwell. John Derby had put the grocery store in Camberwell up for sale, and Edwards said he was interested in purchasing and asked to see the accounts. While Derby prepared the books, his wife, carrying their infant daughter in her arms, invited Edwards upstairs to view the living quarters. Alone with the young woman, he took a large iron sash weight he had concealed inside a rolled-up newspaper and battered her to death. He then went downstairs, bludgeoned Derby to death, and then callously strangled the crying child. Edwards began pawning Derby's belongings and, using the name William Derby, took the lease on a house in Leighton. Thinking he had got away with committing the murders, he decided to repeat the venture. On the 23rd of December, another grocer with a business for sale was invited to Leighton to discuss terms, and as he turned to leave, he was struck from behind. Despite a fearful beating, the man managed to escape and raise the alarm. Edwards was arrested for assault. The police searched the house and, finding pawn tickets in the name of Derby, led them to Camberwell, and soon the bodies of the Derby family were discovered buried in the garden at the house in Leighton. After being found guilty, Edwards burst into laughter and, asked if he had anything to say, replied, "No, get on with it as quick as you like." When Henry and Billy Billington went to observe Edwards on the night before his execution, they found him a big strapping fellow who had borne his fate bravely, asking his brother, who had visited him earlier that afternoon, to keep news of his execution secret from his aged mother. Newspaper reports of the trial had used the name Edgar Edwards, although his real name was Edgar Owen. Entering the cell at 9 o'clock, Henry recorded that Edwards stood between two warders with staring eyes that saw nothing. The grim procession made its way along the corridor, then out of a side door, down a flight of steps into the prison yard, where the scaffold was waiting for him. Edwards began to recite the hymn, "Jesus, lover of my soul," as he neared the scaffold. His self-possession began to desert him a little as they reached the drop, but the executioners went to work quickly, and seconds later he had paid for his triple crime. Instead of returning home that morning, the two decided to spend the day at the Crystal Palace exhibition hall. Henry later told a story to his son about an incident that happened as they made their way home later that evening. He said they decided to call into a public house before catching their train from Euston. Leaning leisurely against a saloon bar on the Euston Road, they were enjoying a drink when a group of young men, hooligans as they were named in the press of the day, entered the bar and approached. One placed a clay pipe on the bar close to the arm of Billington, who had his back to the door. Henry noticed what had happened and whispered for Billington to take care. Turning to see what was afoot, he sent the clay pipe crashing to the floor. An altercation then took place, during which the young gang pulled out knives and picked up chairs as weapons. The hangmen were made of stern stuff, and in the ensuing struggle they were able to drive the men out of the bar. Henry later told his son they were escorted to the train by a group of aged local men who said it was the best sport they had seen in a long while. He also said that they left without a scratch, but this doesn't seem to be the case, as Billington arrived home sporting a badly bruised face and a damaged arm. He explained his injuries by saying he had been attacked in his railway carriage and had fallen onto the track. On the 13th of May, shortly before the birth of his daughter Ivy, Henry made the short trip across Manchester to assist at the execution of William Hudson, a 26-year-old Birmingham soldier who was shot dead a comrade at Fulwood Barracks in Preston. The next letter requesting Pierrepoint's services was again to carry out an execution as the chief hangman. It would be the first time he was entrusted with the execution of two people for the same crime. He was to hang a young London motor mechanic, William Tuffin, along with his lover and former housemaid, Mary Stone. They had been living in a house in South London where the battered body of his wife had been concealed. Acting on a tip-off from concerned relatives, police had called at the house in Thames Ditton, where the body of Caroline Tuffin was discovered. She had been battered to death. Tuffin and Mary Stone had vanished, but were soon located at Norbiton railway station and arrested. Mary claimed to know nothing about the death of Caroline Tuffin, William having told her his wife had gone away. Tuffin was found guilty of murder and Stone guilty of being an accessory before the fact. Sentence of death was then passed on both prisoners. Tuffin was to hang on Tuesday 11th of August at Wandsworth, with Mary Stone going to the gallows at Holloway on the following morning. Mary Stone was reprieved on the 6th of August, and Tuffin alone went to the gallows a few days later. A rare execution took place at Devizes on the 17th of November, when Billy Billington and Henry hanged Edward Permer, who was shot dead his girlfriend at Swindon. Permer and Esther Swinford had been engaged, and she had given him money to buy furniture for their home, which he had spent on drink. As a result, the wedding was cancelled. he became sullen and later moved away from Swindon. Several months later, he heard that Esther was working as a barmaid in Swindon, and Permer found work on the Great Western Railway and moved back. Carrying a gun, he called at the pub and after a quarrel, shot her dead. In his pocket was a photograph of Esther, and on the back, Permer had written, "The curse of my life." He claimed the gun had gone off accidentally. December 1903 was a busy month for the executioners, with 10 hanged, 9 men and 1 woman, and 3 others reprieved at the 11th hour. On the 15th of December, Henry carried out the last execution at Hereford Jail, when, with assistant John Ellis, they were engaged to execute a 61-year-old quarry labourer, William Haywood, who had been convicted of the murder of his wife at Lupton. He had battered her to death while drunk and was seen moving her body in a wheelbarrow. At his trial, his defence claimed Haywood was an imbecile of the highest grade. Summing up, Mr. Justice Bingham told the jury that lunatics should not escape punishment simply because they were lunatics. On the 29th of December, Pierrepoint assisted for the first time at an execution at Liverpool's Walton Jail. Henry Bertram Starr had married in the spring of 1903, and the couple moved in with his wife's mother. He took to drinking heavily and then left his wife, only to return when she gave birth in August. They moved into their own home, but she soon left and moved back to her mother's. A separation and custody order for the child were obtained, and then, on the 24th of November, Starr called at her mother's house and stabbed his estranged wife to death. It was Starr's second murder trial. In 1896 he had been acquitted, but this time the jury returned a verdict of guilty without even leaving the courtroom to ponder the outcome. Billy Billington carried out the execution while his brother Jack officiated at a double execution at Leeds. One presumes that Henry Pierrepoint must have already accepted the offer to assist at Liverpool before the Leeds execution was confirmed, otherwise it would almost certainly have been offered to him. Now he had a further rival for the role of chief executioner, as once Jack Billington had pulled the lever and graduated to a number 1, as a chief executioner was known in those circles, he began to be offered more work.